Nobody noticed the change when it started, and the reason nobody noticed had nothing to do with Marcus being careful about hiding it. It had everything to do with the fact that the people around him had stopped paying the kind of attention that would have been required to see it, had settled into the comfortable assumption that they already knew who Marcus was and what his life looked like, and what his days contained, and assumptions of that kind have a way of making the actual evidence invisible. The signs were there for anyone willing to look at them honestly. A missed invitation to something he would previously have attended without hesitation, declined with a short message that gave no explanation and invited no follow-up. A phone call that went unanswered and was not returned, from someone who had always been able to reach him whenever they tried. Fewer appearances in the places where his presence had once been reliable enough to be taken for granted. A quality of silence around his name that was different from the silence of someone who simply hasn't been in touch recently. A silence that carried something in it that nobody examined closely enough to identify. The people in his life assembled these observations into a story that fit the shape of their existing understanding of him, the most available explanation requiring the least revision of what they already believed. They thought he was becoming less, withdrawing, shrinking, losing the energy and the engagement that makes a person visible to the people around them. Not one of them considered the alternative. That the silence wasn't the sound of someone disappearing, that it was the sound of something being built in a place where the building couldn't be interrupted by people who didn't understand what was under construction. The strange thing looking back wasn't that Marcus had disappeared from the places where people expected to find him. The strange thing was that something had already begun long before he left. And every person who thought they knew him had been standing close enough to see it and had seen nothing at all. In the absence of information, people construct explanations with whatever material is available to them, and the material most readily available is usually their own assumptions dressed up as observation. His name came up in conversations with the particular energy of a subject that people feel entitled to have opinions about, and the opinions that circulated were assembled with the confidence of people who had not spoken to him recently and therefore felt free to speak about him at length. Some said he was lost, which was the explanation that carried the most sympathy and allowed the people offering it to feel generously concerned rather than casually dismissive. Some said he had no direction, which was the explanation that required the most evidence to support and receive the least scrutiny before being accepted as valid by the people who found it satisfying. Others said he had given up, which was the explanation that people offered when they wanted to communicate disappointment while maintaining the appearance of neutral observation. The less they saw of him, the more certain they became about what his absence meant, each passing week adding confidence to conclusions that had been formed without the benefit of any actual information about what he was doing with his time. Marcus heard some of it, knew the rest of it was happening even when he couldn't hear it directly. He never corrected anyone. Never appeared in the conversations to offer the honest account that would have required them to revise everything they had so confidently constructed in his absence. Never defended himself to people who had already decided what they were defending against. The silence he maintained in response to their certainty was the most deliberate thing about him during this entire period, more deliberate than anything else he was doing, more considered than it appeared from the outside. He understood something that the people talking about him did not. The less he spoke, the more completely they revealed what they had always believed about him, underneath the versions of support and connection they had performed while he was present to receive them. They thought they knew what was happening in the life of Marcus. Not one of them was anywhere close. Here is what the early mornings looked like, the ones nobody witnessed because nobody was there and nobody thought to ask. 5 o'clock. A room lit by a single lamp. The city outside the window still in the particular darkness that exists in the last hour before the world starts moving. A darkness that has a quality of permission to it, a sense that what happens inside it belongs entirely to the person awake enough to use it. Marcus at a desk. Not performing productivity for an audience. Not moving through a routine designed to be documented or displayed. Working with the specific quality of focus that only exists when no part of the mind is divided between the task and the awareness of being observed. The nights were quiet in a way that quiet doesn't usually feel to someone who has recently been surrounded by the noise of other people's presence and other people's opinions and the ongoing social management that relationships require. This quiet was different. It had a texture to it that took several weeks to recognize as something valuable rather than something to be relieved by filling it with anything available. He was learning the difference between solitude chosen and solitude endured, and discovering that the first kind produced things the second kind never could. What was being built in those mornings and those quiet nights was not visible in any form that the people assembling their confident explanations about his life would have recognized as construction. No title being pursued, no status being accumulated, no achievement taking shape that would eventually be displayed as evidence of where the time had gone. Identity, the specific and unglamorous and entirely necessary work of deciding, without the influence of other people's expectations or other people's timelines or the ambient pressure of being observed and evaluated, who he actually was when those things were removed. Discipline that belonged to him rather than being performed for someone else's approval. Standards that had been chosen rather than inherited. A self-respect that had been built from the inside out rather than borrowed from external validation that could be withdrawn without warning. He wasn't building a career, he was building a person. And by the time the people who had been constructing their confident explanations started paying attention again, the version of Marcus they had known with such comfortable certainty was already completely and permanently gone. The change became visible gradually and then suddenly, the way things that have been developing beneath the surface for a long time become visible once they have developed far enough that concealment is no longer possible even without any intention of revealing them. People noticed the energy first before they had identified anything specific enough to name. A quality in the way he occupied a room that hadn't been present before, a groundedness that communicated something without requiring him to say anything about it. The decisions he made began to reflect something that previous decisions had not consistently reflected, a clarity of direction that suggested the person making them knew something about where they were headed that made each choice less complicated than the same choice would have been before. The standards he held for his own time and attention had shifted in ways that became apparent to the people who attempted to access that time and attention in the ways they had previously been able to access it without much consideration. Curiosity replaced the comfortable certainty that had allowed people to speak about him with such confidence in his absence. Questions appeared where conclusions had previously been so settled that questions hadn't seemed necessary. The attention returned from people who had redirected it elsewhere during the months of silence, from people whose attention had not been missed while it was absent, but whose return announced something about the direction things had moved. And Marcus received all of it with the particular quality of response that belongs to someone who has spent a significant period of time operating completely independently of the need for that kind of reception. Not coldly, not with the performance of indifference that people sometimes produce when they want to communicate that they have transcended caring. Just from a different place than the one the attention had previously found him in, a place where the validation being offered landed differently because it was no longer filling a need that had been emptied in the meantime. The biggest difference was not visible in anything Marcus had produced or accumulated or achieved during the months nobody had been paying attention. It was visible in what he no longer needed. And that was when the people who had been so certain about what they understood began slowly and without any announcement to realize they had misunderstood everything from the beginning. The deepest truth about what had happened during those months, the thing that explained everything else when you finally held it in the right light, was simple enough to be missed precisely because of its simplicity. Everyone watching for evidence of what Marcus was building had been watching for the wrong category of evidence entirely. They had been watching for the visible kind, the external markers that announce themselves as proof of something happening, the achievements and the status and the recognition that constitute success in the language most people have been taught to speak fluently from the beginning of their lives. What Marcus had been building was invisible by nature, not invisible because it was hidden or because he had made any effort to conceal it from the people looking. Invisible because confidence built from the inside cannot be seen from the outside until it has been present long enough to change the way a person moves through everything. And by the time it becomes visible, the building has already been completed for months. Invisible because discipline accumulated in the quiet hours before the world is awake does not produce any immediate and observable output that can be pointed to as evidence that something is being constructed. Invisible because character developed through the patient and unglamorous work of deciding who you are without an audience has no press release and no announcement and no moment of reveal. The foundations had been laid in mornings nobody witnessed. The structure had been built in quiet nights that contained no audience. The finishing work had been completed in the solitude that everyone around him had interpreted as loss, and that had been in the specific and irreversible way of things that cannot be undone, everything but that. By the time the world directed its attention back toward Marcus with the revised and curious energy of people who sense they have missed something significant, the work was already done. Not in progress, not approaching completion, done. In the way that things are done when the person who has done them is no longer the same person who started them. The reason nobody knew what Marcus was building was not complicated when finally understood. The most important construction that any person can undertake in the course of their life happens in exactly the kind of invisible and unglamorous and entirely unwitnessed way that makes it impossible for the people watching for visible evidence to detect while it is happening. It happens in the specific quality of attention a person brings to the hours that belong only to them. In the decisions made when the outcome serves no one's assessment of who you are except your own. In the slow and patient and entirely private work of becoming someone whose foundation is real enough to hold whatever is eventually built on top of it. The world notices the building once it is standing. What the world almost never sees is the ground it is standing on. And by the time anyone thought to look, Marcus had already moved on to whatever came next. The work was finished. It had been finished for a long time.